Since arrays are in their very nature list-oriented, you might expect that we could use a loop to iterate over all the contents inside of an array. And it's true, they help us out very much. Let's take a look at this number list. So you can see here that we have 10 numbers in a new array called number list. If we wanted to iterate through every one of those numbers in the array, we could establish a for loop that starts at the very first index, notice that that is 0, and proceeds all the way through the very last index, notice that that is 9, even though the length of the array is 10. Then we could use the console.log method to produce a string that says the value in cell I, notice we're referring to the particular index that we're at, is number list I, and number list I refers to the actual contents of the cell at index I. Remember not to confuse the index, which is the position we're at, with its actual contents, which is the value. So let's kind of take a look at how this works in action. So when we start at I equals 0, our very first index, we'll ask the question whether I is less than the length of the entire array, and of course that's true. And then we retrieve the value at number list I, which is 2, and our printout becomes the value in cell 0 is 2. We do the same thing when we get to index 1. We ask the question, is I less than number list.length? Yes, it is. And the value in that cell is 5, and so we get the value in cell 1 is 5. That procedure repeats throughout the entire loop until we get to the actual length of the array, when our question becomes false and we stop the loop. So we've looked at arrays that have a whole lot of contents in them, and you might ask the question, can you have an array with no contents in it, or can you have an array with cells that are empty? Yes, you can. Let's take a look at that. We can use the undefined value to create empty cells, because the undefined value just means no contents. Looking in our existing numbers list array, if we wanted to make cell 5 empty, we could just use our regular cell reference notation with numbers list 5 and set that equal to undefined. That instantly makes that cell, the 5th index in the array, empty. So now that we know how to erase contents from arrays, let's see if we can write some code that will do two things. We want to count the even numbers in our number list as well as erase the odd numbers. Ready? Here we go. So we've got our number list array already, and we know that we're going to need to count our even values, so we'll set up a variable called evenCount that will gradually count the even numbers in our array. Then we'll start our for loop that progresses through the array just as our previous for loop did. Inside the loop, we need a way to check if we have an even number. If our reference value divided by 2 has a remainder of 0, we will increase the evenCount variable because we have found an even number. But otherwise, if we don't have an even number, what do we have? An odd number. And so we should erase that number. How do we do that? Well, we say that the numbers list I, in other words, the value at the current index, should be undefined. And once we have done that, that value is no longer there. At the end of this code, we could also log out the current even count, and that would be 5. Let's take a look at that code in action. When the index is 0, we check to see if we are still within the array length, and we are. So then we get the number list value, which is 2, and then we check to see if 2 is an even number. 2, of course, is an even number, and so our even count would advance to 1. This procedure reoccurs throughout the entire array, erasing odd values and counting the even values. When we finally get to the end of the array, the loop stops, and you can see that we have an even count of 5. What if we were to now log out our changed number list? What would that look like? Taking a look, we see here that our array kept all of our even numbers and erased all of the odds, but still left empty cells where the odds used to be. Those are represented here by the undefineds. And to show that the size of our array hasn't really changed at all, we can log out that using the .length property to see that the array is still of length 10. Now that we know significantly more about arrays, we're going to build a function that solves our initial problem of building a passenger list. So here's our function called addPassenger, and we know that that function is going to need two parameters. The first is the passenger's name that we're adding, as well as the array of passengers that we want to add the passenger to. Inside our function, we know that if the list is empty, we may as well just add the passenger to the list. We're okay with that. Otherwise, we know the list is not empty, and so we need to find the exact right spot to put the new passenger. So what we do is we iterate over all spots in our passenger list, and if the current spot is empty, we want to add our current passenger to that spot since it's empty, and then we want to exit the function. Otherwise, if we've gotten all the way to the end of the list and the passenger still has not been added, we need to add that passenger to the back of the array, increasing its size. So that's our pseudocode. Let's see if we can get some real code in its place. The first thing we know is that if the list.length property is 0, then the list is empty, right? So we can just push the name of the passenger onto the list. Otherwise, the list is not empty, so we know we're going to need a loop to check for empty spots. Here's our loop. It looks just like the other one. We will proceed through the entire length of the array looking for empty spots. Well, how do we know if it's an empty spot? We have to use our undefined trick. If the current spot we're looking at, list I, is the undefined value, we know it's empty. So therefore we can place the name of the current passenger being added in that cell. Then we can immediately exit the function because we're done adding that passenger. Notice that the return keyword here has nothing follow it. That's totally acceptable when you just want to exit the function with no value. Now we also have an else if statement that follows that checks to see if we have reached the very last cell of the array. If we have, what do we know? We know that we have not reached an empty spot yet for this array. So we can go ahead and push the current passenger onto the back end of the array, increasing its size. Then at the very bottom of the function, we'll put one final return list so that we can ensure that the modified list has been returned to the program. Great, so now we've got a passenger adding function. How awesome. Let's see if we can build a passenger list from scratch and start adding some passengers to it. Here we go. So we'll start a variable called passengers list and we'll set it up as an empty list. We can do that with just 2 brackets. Then we'll call our addPassenger function and we're going to add Greg to it. So you can see our very first parameter is Greg Pollock as a string, followed by our newly created but empty passenger list. What gets returned is a new array with Greg Pollock as the very first and only cell. Then let's add Ashley Smith using the same exact procedure. What gets returned is our modified array that has Greg in the first spot and Ashley in the second spot. We could do it one more time and put John in the third spot. Awesome, we've got a full list of, well, 3 passengers. So let's see if we can now delete some passengers by building a delete passenger function. Here we go. So we got our delete passenger function. It's also going to take in a name and also the list. You can see that we'll check if the list length is 0. That means there's no passengers in this list, so how could we possibly delete anybody from it? And all we need to log out is that the list is empty. Otherwise, we'll start our loop that checks the entire contents of the array. Inside the loop, if the cell that we're currently checking is the name that we're looking for, we'll go ahead and set that cell to be empty, having removed the passenger. Then we can return the list because we don't need to look for that passenger anymore. Otherwise, we have an else if here that checks to see if we have arrived at the very last cell. If we have arrived at the very last cell, but we have deleted no passenger, that means that the passenger does not exist in our current list, and so we can report with a console log that the passenger was not found. At the very end, we will also return the list. Why? Because if we've returned the list somewhere else in the function, we know that our exterior program is expecting some kind of list to be returned. So it's good practice to make sure that we return the list whether it has been modified or not. So now we've built both an add passenger list and a delete passenger list. We have full control of our passenger list. Let's go ahead and mess around with it. First, we'll take out Ashley Smith from our existing list. So our loop seeks through the array, finds her in the second cell, and erases her from that cell. Notice now that we get a return of an array that has the second cell empty. Then we'll add Adam to the list. Notice that our add passenger function finds the very first empty spot and places Adam inside that spot first. Then we'll try to delete Ashley again. Uh-oh, she's not found. That's of course because we deleted her before. Then if we try to delete Greg, he'll be removed from the very first spot. And then if we try to add Jennifer, she'll be placed in Greg's old spot, the first cell. So now you are an array master. Congratulations. We'll release you to the challenges. Good luck. In there we could do be able to push a piece onto the end. What?
This is no laughing Friday.
No laughing Friday.
And then...
Oh, I busted it.